Tim Robbins is one of the rare faces in Hollywood who has both reached the peak of artistic achievement and maintained a profound personal imprint. A man who has spent more than 4 decades building a career that is not loud but full of weight. He won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor with his haunting role in Mystic River, and also received the Golden Globe and Screen Actors Guild Awards for the same role. Before that, he left an indelible mark with the role of Andy Dufresne in The Shawshank Redemption, a film ranked among the greatest works of all time, a cinematic symbol of hope and resilience. Not stopping at acting, Robbins also proved his stature behind the camera when he directed Dead Man Walking, a film that earned Oscar nominations and helped Susan Sarandon win the Oscar for Best Actress. He also founded the Actors Gang, an influential theater troupe that brings art to the community, and even to prisons. His career is not measured by the number of blockbuster films, but by its depth, by works that touch the conscience and moral questions of society. He is honored not only as an actor, but as a true artist, a storyteller through silence and inner depth, a man who does not chase the spotlight, but leaves a longer-lasting imprint than any commercial star. But behind those achievements is another story, a story that no golden statue can cover. At the age of 67, when the lights gradually recede, Tim Robbins is no longer at the center of Hollywood. He lives quietly, almost detached from the world that once honored him. The relationship that lasted more than 2 decades with Susan Sarandon ended in silence, leaving a void that cannot be named. A man who once brought hope to millions of viewers now has to face the feeling of not belonging anywhere. He chose to speak out his political views and accepted the trade-off for his career. Chose to step away from the mainstream to keep his personal values, and in that silence is another kind of pain, not loud but lingering, not broken but simmering, an unseen battle between becoming an icon and keeping his true self. Tim Robbins did not collapse. He did not disappear. He just stepped back, living with his choices, continuing to make art in his own way, continuing to exist not as a star, but as a human still trying to find meaning in his own life. Before continuing into the journey behind the spotlight of Tim Robbins, please hit like and subscribe to the channel as a way to honor the man who has devoted his whole life to bringing hope to others, even when he himself has to live in the silences that no one sees. After all that the world has seen in Tim Robbins, the awards, the roles that made millions cry, the moments when he seemed to understand human pain better than they did themselves, there is a truth that few realize, that the feeling of not belonging did not begin when he left Hollywood, but had started much earlier, from the early years of life, where a child who should have found safety instead grew up amid sounds that never stopped but never brought peace. Tim Robbins was born into an artistic family, an environment that from the outside looked rich in emotion and creativity, but inside was filled with undercurrents of conflict and instability. His father, a political activist, an artist with strong ideals, not only brought societal debates home, but also brought tension, confrontation, emotional waves that never truly settled. Meanwhile, his mother, an actress, lived in her own inner world, sensitive but fragile, sometimes close, sometimes distant, as if she herself was struggling with emotions that no one could see. And between those two people, Tim did not grow up in the silence of poverty, but in the noise of things that were never resolved. A home that was not lacking in voices, not lacking in movement, but lacking the most important thing for a child, the feeling of safety, the feeling that there was a place where he could stop, could breathe, could be himself without needing to be on guard. His childhood had no fixed point. The family moved constantly. Cities changed, people changed, rooms changed, and each time a small part of him was left behind. There was no place long enough to call home, no community deep enough to create a sense of belonging. He learned to adapt, but never truly connected. Learned to exist in new spaces, but never felt he was part of them. And over time, that was no longer just circumstance. It became part of who he was, an invisible habit, a shell he carried throughout his life, while other children found themselves in play, in friends, in stable memories. Tim grew up as an observer, standing on the edge of everything, looking into the world rather than stepping into it, listening more than speaking, feeling more than expressing. Because when you are not sure where you belong, you start keeping distance, not because you do not want to connect, but because you do not know how long the connection will last. The first cracks in his psyche did not come from a big event, but from hundreds of small moments, the times he had to leave before getting familiar, the times he had to start over without time to finish, the times of silence while there was noise all around. And gradually, isolation was no longer a temporary feeling. It became the default state, part of his identity, a way of existing. And perhaps right in those years, something formed inside Tim Robbins, an ability to understand human pain deeply, but at the same time, an invisible distance that made him never truly step fully into any world. Not family, not society, and later, not even Hollywood. Because when you grow up without a place to belong, you can learn to exist everywhere, but never truly belong anywhere. And that is where his story really begins. Not with lights, not with fame, but with a silent, lingering void that almost no one notices. And from that silent void, Tim Robbins stepped into adulthood, not with the feeling of starting a new journey, but as if he was only continuing a sense of displacement that had existed long before, while others entered college with excitement, with clear dreams, with the belief that they were getting closer to the person they wanted to become. Tim instead stepped into the world of art with a question that never had an answer. Who am I really in all of this? He chose to study acting, chose the path of art, perhaps because it was the closest thing to his family, to the environment he grew up in. But the deeper he went, the more he realized something that tormented him, that he was not like the others. He did not have the explosive confidence of a future star. He did not have the obvious sharpness that made others notice him immediately. In class, he was not the one called first, not the person who made the whole room fall silent when he walked in. He often stood in the back, observing, listening, feeling, but rarely truly stepping forward, as if a part of him always held back, always cautious, always afraid that if he moved too close to the light, he would be seen and judged as not enough, not special enough, not outstanding enough, not enough to exist in a world where everything revolved around being seen. And that very thing made him become someone standing on the edge, not only of the class, but of the entire surrounding environment. In rehearsals, auditions, conversations, he was present but not truly there, like a shadow moving among people full of ambition. When they talked about big roles, about a bright future, Tim remained silent, not because he had no dreams, but because he was not sure if that dream was meant for him. And when the first roles began to come, they were not breakthroughs, not life-changing opportunities, but only small roles, supporting parts, brief appearances that if you did not pay attention, you would not realize he had been there. He went from one project to another, from a small set to a nameless role, and each time he carried the same familiar feeling. Am I moving forward, or just drifting through without anyone really seeing me? His career did not collapse, but it also did not explode. It existed in a halfway state, enough to continue, but not enough to affirm itself. And that very state was what exhausted people the most, because when you fail, at least you know you have failed. But when you only exist in the gray area, you begin to doubt yourself, doubt the path you chose, doubt whether you had been going in the wrong direction from the start. And for Tim Robbins, the greatest fear was not being rejected but being overlooked, being forgotten, becoming invisible in the very industry he had chosen to find himself, someone who appeared but left no trace, someone who worked but was not remembered. And that fear was not loud, not intense. It was silent, creeping, growing with each passing year, with each role no one mentioned, with each audition without result, with each time he stood in a room full of people and felt he did not truly belong there. And perhaps the most painful thing was that he could not blame anyone for it, because the world did not owe him attention, did not owe him success, and did not owe him a position. But precisely because of that, everything became heavier. Because if no one was wrong, then did the problem lie with him? And that question, repeating in the mind of a young man, gradually became a deeper crack. A crack that no one saw but affected every decision, every step, every way he viewed himself. And amid all of that, Tim Robbins still continued, not because he was certain, but because he did not know what else to do. Continued walking in a world he had never felt he belonged to, continued playing roles that no one remembered, continued existing in an industry he feared one day would swallow him whole, not by failure, but by complete silence. The early years of Tim Robbins' career were not a series of glamorous days or legendary roles, but a silent journey, where every opportunity came with rejection, where the stage light seemed to shine on others rather than on him. With the presence of an ambitious young actor like Robbins, could still easily be forgotten among hundreds of other faces on the same screen or in the same audition. Right from the first roles, Robbins realized that his tall build, scholarly yet quiet appearance, along with a style that did not fit Hollywood's commercial standards, made it not easy for him to catch the eye of producers, not considered a potential star in the usual mold, and that very thing created a simmering pressure, a feeling of being excluded without any explanation needed. Every time he stepped into an audition, Robbins carried a tension that was both familiar and new. He had to present himself, prove his ability, but also knew that even if he acted well, there was no guarantee he would be remembered. The supporting roles, the short scenes, the mild compliments that did not lead to the next opportunity, all created a long, drawn-out chain of days, where his effort and hard work did not reflect back into concrete results. He worked continuously. Every day was an audition. Every performance was standing in front of the camera and invisible audience. But inside each step, a part of Tim Robbins began to feel tired. A part began to wonder if the path he chose was right. On the outside, he was an actor trying hard, diligently learning, reading scripts, practicing, connecting with people in the industry, always maintaining a professional and humble attitude. But inside, he felt the emptiness gradually growing, a vague feeling that he was existing but not truly needed, not truly seen, not truly valued for what he had contributed. Each rejection, each time being eliminated, each indifferent look from a director or casting agent was like adding another heavy brick onto his shoulders, and Tim Robbins began to realize that the greatest pain was not being rejected, but the feeling that his efforts were invisible, that his hard work, passion, and talent were not enough to make an impact, that in the harsh world of Hollywood, a man could exist without anyone truly needing him. Throughout those years, Robbins learned to adapt to the state of invisibility, learned to exist without needing recognition, learned to nurture his passion inside, without expecting any reward from the outside. He read scripts late into the night, joined workshops, practiced every line, every small movement, every rhythm in the scene. But all those efforts, from the outside, looked like quiet footsteps on an invisible road. That sense of isolation did not only come from the harshness of the industry, but also from realizing that he himself was always different, not the type Hollywood favored, not the appearance that easily attracted audiences, not the sensual or commercially appealing style. That difference made him stand outside, observing more than participating, listening more than speaking, and gradually that difference became part of his identity. An artist who pursued inner truth rather than chasing artificial spotlight. But in the isolation and silence, Robbins did not completely give up. On the contrary, that loneliness began to form an inner strength, a persistent will that only those who have lived long in the shadows can understand. He learned to turn failure into lessons, turn rejections into motivation, turn the feeling of invisibility into the ability to observe and deeply understand people, learn to persevere day by day, performance by performance, role by role, until finally those seeds of effort would bloom in later roles, in awards, in stories that touched the hearts of audiences. But even when he knew that one day the results would come, every step in the early years of his career was still a silent battle. A man standing between light and shadow, unseen, but refusing to collapse, still walking, still acting, still existing, though deep down, his belief in himself sometimes wavered, and the feeling of, "I exist, but no one needs me," still silently followed him in every scene, every audition, every long day waiting for an opportunity that had not yet appeared. And that very pain, the silent, lingering, unseen pain, was what forged the resilient spirit, determination, and extraordinary inner strength of Tim Robbins. A man who later, when reaching the peak, still kept his depth, still perceived the world through the eyes of someone who had gone through years when no one saw him. A man who had learned that living is not always about being recognized, but one must still continue to walk, continue to find his own light. When Tim Robbins received the role of Andy Dufresne in the Shawshank Redemption, no one could know that this role would become a cinematic icon, an image etched in the minds of millions of viewers about patience, endurance, and hope in despair. But for Robbins himself at that time, this was a rare yet challenging opportunity, because the role required him to step into a heavy psychological state, to isolate his emotions, to turn himself into a man living in prison, seeing suffering, violence, and injustice every day, but still keeping a fragile light in his soul, an unbreakable faith. And during the filming process, Robbins had to learn to endure isolation, learn to keep silent in every scene, learn to let his eyes and gestures speak instead of words, because Andy Dufresne was not explosive, but his silence and inner strength were what made viewers feel that hope still existed, even in the darkest places. And Tim Robbins poured his entire self into the character, putting his mind and body into emotions that only those who had experienced deep loneliness and loss could understand. The seemingly simple scenes were actually an inner battle every minute, every second, where he had to keep himself from being swept away by the emotional storm, while also conveying the feeling of patience and hope to the audience without any explanation appearing in the script. And although Robbins had given everything to the role, when The Shawshank Redemption was released, the film failed at the box office, was received cautiously by audiences, and critics at the time did not pay much attention. And Tim Robbins, the person who had lived every moment with the character, was not recognized immediately, had no praise, no awards or sudden fame. But the most ironic and painful thing was, the role that he had poured his whole life into to give soul, the role that brought hope to millions of people out there, did not bring any recognition or reward to him. And that very paradox, that simmering pain, became a new layer of emotion in Robbins' soul, making him feel more deeply the meaning of patience, of endurance, and of faith, that sometimes the greatest value of an action is not the spotlight or money, but the impact it creates for others. And Robbins, in the days waiting for recognition, still continued to walk, continued to work on the next projects, but his heart always carried loneliness, silence, and a fragile hope that finally every effort, every pain, every contribution was not meaningless, that one day this role would be recognized as it deserved. And indeed, time has proven it. The Shawshank Redemption became an immortal symbol. The story of Andy Dufresne became the typical image of hope that never dies. And Tim Robbins, the man who once stood on the sidelines, who was overlooked by Hollywood, who lived in silence throughout the early years of his career, finally received recognition. But that did not diminish the pain he had gone through. On the contrary, those years of endurance, the silent disappointments, the contributions that went unseen, were exactly what made the victory, though late, become profound and meaningful. And Robbins learned that patience, endurance, and loyalty to himself, to his profession, and to the character were what turned an actor into a living icon in the hearts of audiences. That sometimes real value is not measured by awards or stage lights, but by the ability to touch the human soul. And Tim Robbins had done that, even though he had to go through years of silence, being forgotten, and standing outside all the glory, only for the role that he had poured his mind, body, and emotions into to finally become a gift to the world, a gift that no one could take away, a living proof that hope still exists, even when the people who carry it are not seen. When time passed, Tim Robbins, gradually becoming an icon of intelligent cinema, a man whose every role left a profound imprint in the hearts of audiences. But contrary to the acclaim and resounding applause, Robbins felt a silent void in his own heart, because even though fame came late, even though the awards and praises from prestigious organizations gradually arrived, he still did not feel he truly belonged in Hollywood, where stage lights and award ceremonies were only doors opening for people chasing commercial standards that he never wanted to blend into. Every opportunity, every invitation to join blockbuster films or large commercial projects was carefully considered by him, often rejected because Robbins understood that if he accepted, he would lose a part of himself, trade away his loyalty to art, to the stories he believed in, to the identity that had been forged from the silent years of training and inner struggle. Hollywood saw him as an enigmatic actor, a distant man, not because he rejected fame or money, but because he did not follow the noisy and superficial rhythm of the industry. Producers and colleagues sometimes found it hard to understand the way he chose projects, the way he lived quietly at the peak, and that very thing kept him always standing outside the circle. Even though he was in a position many people dreamed of, success came belatedly, but it did not bring a feeling of completeness. Robbins received recognition, awards, roles that were cherished by audiences and critics, but no light could warm the inner feeling that he was in the right place, that where he stood was truly home. There were days, after stepping off the stage, when all the lights went out. Robbins felt he returned to the position of an observer, a person standing outside everything, where fame could not compensate for the silent loneliness accumulated through the years, where his career sparkled but his heart still carried the emptiness that had formed since childhood. He achieved everything: awards, roles with international stature, endless praises, but he did not achieve the feeling of being in the right place, did not find safety in fame or power. And that very contradiction between resounding success and the feeling of displacement, between the awards and the isolation, forged a different Tim Robbins, a man who always kept his identity, always remained loyal to art, to the stories he wanted to tell, but also had to endure the silent pain that the world could honor him without truly understanding him, could give awards without seeing the loss, could applaud the characters he created while overlooking the real person behind the roles. Every project, every scene, every career choice was a confrontation with this painful paradox: standing at the peak but having no place to call home, achieving everything but still lacking a sense of belonging. Robbins learned to accept that loneliness, learned to turn the feeling of displacement into motivation to continue working, to continue creating roles that touched the souls of viewers, to continue following the path that few understood. But precisely because of that path, he became an icon, not only because of talent, but also because of his determination, loyalty to himself and to art, a man whose every step carried both loneliness and inner strength. And the harsh but beautiful truth is that, thanks to enduring this loneliness, Tim Robbins was able to become himself, an icon rising above all lights, all awards, and all rounds of applause, because even though success was resounding, he knew that his true value did not lie in external recognition, but in the ability to exist and shine even when no one truly saw him. In these years, Robbins continued to keep a sufficient distance for himself to observe, to choose, to live at his own rhythm, both avoiding the traps of fame and not losing the spiritual values he had fought for throughout his life. And this very choice, although bringing persistent loneliness, was what kept Tim Robbins honest with himself. And each role, each project from then on became deeper. The stories he told were not only entertainment, but also lessons about patience, endurance, and faith in oneself, that sometimes standing outside all the glory was also a way to preserve the inner light. And although Hollywood might not understand, the world would still recognize the value of a man who had lived fully in his own way, and in the chain of quiet years facing the feeling of loneliness and displacement. Tim Robbins met Susan Sarandon, a woman who was both profound and intelligent, a kindred soul who from the very first meeting Robbins felt that her presence could be the rare anchor he had once dreamed of. Their relationship was not a glamorous Hollywood love story on magazine covers, but a spiritual connection, where two people not only shared love, but also shared viewpoints, beliefs, and ways of looking at the world. A relationship nurtured by quiet understanding, by deep conversations until late at night, where Tim did not need to hide his loneliness, where Susan did not need to hide her fears and exhaustion. For many years, this was the only place he felt he belonged, a home he had never had before. Not a physical roof, but a spiritual support he could lean on when the outside world continued to spin with lights, awards, and expectations. A place where he was allowed to be himself, without needing to play the role of an icon or a star. Together, they built a family. The first child appeared like a miracle, bringing Tim a completely new feeling of responsibility and love, a sense of connection to the world he had never experienced before. And when the second child was born, this family became the center, became the reason for him to continue. A stopping point where Tim could recharge his spirit after long years of struggling with Hollywood and with himself. Every moment with the children, every laugh, every bedtime story was a brick rebuilding trust and safety that he had lacked when he was little. And this very thing made the relationship with Susan more important than any success or award he had ever achieved. In a world where he still felt he stood outside, this family was the only place he knew he truly belonged, a place where fame, roles, and career pressure could not seep in to destroy the rare peace. But even in this deep connection, Tim Robbins could not avoid challenges, silent contradictions arising from differences in lifestyle, ways of thinking, and personal choices. Hollywood continued to demand from him. His career still needed his focus, and sometimes the dedication to his profession made moments with family become short and tense. Nevertheless, those years created a strong contrast. Outside was the light, the awards, the nonstop work, while inside the family was the anchor, where he found stability and the sense of belonging he had searched for throughout his life. That relationship, for many years, not only kept him standing firm against career pressure, but also helped him understand that true value did not lie in fame, but in the ability to find true companions, people who allowed him to be himself, and that love, connection, and responsibility to family could become the strongest anchor in a life full of changes, loneliness, and silent pains. And Tim Robbins, thanks to Susan Sarandon and the children, could finally feel once that, in the vast and cold world, there still existed a place called home that he truly belonged to. But over time, even the deep and precious bond between Tim Robbins and Susan Sarandon could not avoid silent changes as their careers gradually went in different directions, and that distance began to creep into every detail of their shared life. Tim, who had long been accustomed to isolation from his childhood years and the early years of his career, increasingly withdrew into his own world, seeking safety in silence and in personal artistic projects, while Susan remained at the center of the spotlight, with roles, projects, and events that the public followed closely, a part of life constantly illuminated under camera lenses and lights, something Tim had never gotten used to and never desired. The evenings together, the conversations that were supposed to reconnect the rhythm of the relationship, now became short and quiet. Stories about work, about future plans, about personal projects gradually became fewer, replaced instead by long silences, hesitant gestures, searching eyes that no longer connected as before. There was no big fight, no noisy event or scandal to mark the breakup. Love did not die immediately, but dissolved little by little, slowly and silently, like fog covering a summer day, until both felt that even though they still loved, even though they still cherished each other, their separate paths had become too far apart and could no longer be walked together. Tim realized that the years of silence and withdrawal he had dedicated to himself, to his profession, and to his inner survival now became a barrier in the relationship he had once seen as his only anchor, while Susan, with her passionate nature and work that always occupied her mind, could not adjust her pace to keep up with the partner who had grown accustomed to a slow and discreet rhythm. And this very difference, not through one argument or conflict, but through unspoken moments, through waiting in silence, made the fragile relationship gradually become brittle. Tim Robbins felt the pain of loving someone he could not fully accompany, the feeling that even though affection remained, even though there was mutual respect, the distance kept widening with each year, with each project, with each personal choice, and a deep fear began to appear. Would there come a day when that distance could no longer be mended? Would the love that had once been his only anchor turn into a memory he had to keep to himself? In the rare moments they were together, they still smiled, still talked, still shared about the children and beautiful memories. But Tim knew that even those moments were only temporary, like waves lapping on the sand and then receding, leaving a feeling of emptiness and simmering distance. And this slow dissolution, without a loud explosion but painful, taught him an important lesson. Love does not always end with a big battle or a sudden event. Sometimes it dissolves little by little, silently, in quietness, in moments of looking at each other without fully understanding each other. And in those years, Tim Robbins learned to both hold on to himself and accept the truth that even the most precious connection could quietly crack, and that love sometimes was not enough to keep two separate paths together, but still enough to teach a man about patience, endurance, and the true value of cherishing what once was, even when it no longer belonged to him. In 29, a year that was not marked by stage lights or standout new roles, Tim Robbins had to face one of the most painful moments in his life, when the relationship that had lasted more than 2 decades with Susan Sarandon officially ended. There was no scandal, no fuss appearing on the pages of newspapers, no loud arguments or heated debates. Everything happened in silence, quietly, like the days he had grown familiar with since childhood. But that silence carried a terrible weight, so heavy that Tim felt as if he had lost the final foundation he had once relied on, the only place that made him feel he truly belonged, the place where light and shadow, success and failure, could all be shared without judgment or condemnation. A sentence that Susan once uttered in that moment haunted him. "You were never there." And Tim Robbins knew that it was not his career, not the Hollywood spotlight or the awards he had achieved, but precisely that safe place, the place where he found belonging, that had completely disappeared. And this loss, although witnessed by no one, was more painful than all the failures he had ever experienced. The days after everything ended, Robbins walked between the familiar light and shadow of Hollywood. But this time, the feeling of loneliness was deeper, heavier, as if every step echoed in an empty room, reminding him that the only spiritual support, the only anchor of his heart, was gone. Every wall in the house, every corner of the stage, every road he walked past, reminded him that the distance was not only physical, but also psychological. Tim had lost a part of himself, the part that only existed when there was a companion, someone who understood and shared the inner rhythm with him. He did not lose his career, did not lose his acting ability, but he lost the only place where his heart truly felt safe and belonged. And that loss made all achievements, all the roles he had poured his heart into, feel temporary and empty, like decorations filling a void that could not touch his soul. In the months that followed, Tim Robbins lived in silence and self-reflection, wondering how a love that had lasted more than 20 years could quietly fracture in such a silent way, and whether he had truly been present, truly given enough or not. Every memory of happy moments, the smiles, the late-night conversations, the time sharing with the children, now became fragile, fading like morning mist, and he realized that faith and hope, even when given to others, could not replace a loss that had happened silently without anyone witnessing it. But precisely in that void and pain, Tim Robbins began to recognize his own inner strength. If there was no longer any place to call home in the outside world, then he had to find home within himself, had to learn to live and keep his identity even when no one was by his side. This moment became the emotional climax of a man, not because he lost his career or fame, but because he lost the only place he had ever felt he belonged. And this loss, deep and simmering, turned into a new strength, teaching him that hope, faith, and identity do not lie outside the world, but in the ability to endure, stand firm, and continue walking through the voids that life creates. And Tim Robbins, although his heart was full of pain, still continued to live, still continued to create art, still continued to stand firm even when the world was silent, because sometimes victory is not about being seen, but about not losing oneself. After those months of losing the only anchor in his life, Tim Robbins quietly withdrew from the spotlight, gave up flashy projects, gave up noisy award ceremonies, and accepted a life that was almost detached from Hollywood, where the winds of glory no longer blew toward him, where the eyes of audiences, rounds of applause, or words of praise no longer seemed relevant. With no major relationship left to keep him standing firm in the glamorous world, Tim chose a quiet way of living, letting his heart rest after 2 decades of moments that were both intoxicating and painful, and in that solitude, the feeling of returning to childhood became clear. Once again, he was a child, standing on the edge of the world, alone, without any anchor, looking into the emptiness around him and realizing that even though he had reached the peak of his career, the world continued to turn without needing him, and that those bright stage lights never waited for him to step in. Hollywood, with all its noise and glamour, continued without needing him, and he, in this free but painful choice, also continued without needing Hollywood, doing the things he wanted, at his own pace with smaller projects, roles that were more artistic than commercial, appearances that only he himself and a few people truly felt the real value of. In those quiet years, Tim lived with a feeling that was both familiar and strange. Familiar because he had long been used to loneliness from childhood, to the voids that no one filled, and strange because he had once been used to being recognized, to applause, to being cherished, now left with only himself and deep reflections, moments that no one knew about. Each day was a journey of relearning how to find balance, how to nurture inner strength, how to accept that value did not lie out there, but in the ability to live fully with oneself. Mornings, he woke up in the quiet house, not to prepare for filming scenes, not to step onto the red carpet, but only for himself, for the person he still was, and that very silence became medicine for the soul, helping him look back on his life, on his achievements, his failures, and the losses that no explanation could soothe. Hollywood could continue with new stars, new projects, but Robbins knew he no longer needed to chase it. He did not need fame or stage lights to feel he had value. Instead, he chose to make art in his own way, teaching theater, supporting the community through the Actors Gang, participating in social activities, and spending time observing, reflecting, living with what remained for himself. In those quiet moments, the feeling of being alone, without any anchor, became motivation for him to understand that no matter how many lights went out or how many awards no longer came, his identity and belief in his own value still had to be maintained, and this very solitude, which seemed like a loss, became a source of strength for Tim Robbins to stand firm, to continue telling stories through art, to live honestly, and to prove that a person could exist, could shine, and could find meaning even when no one saw, that sometimes the freedom and solitude and silence were what helped a soul breathe fully and not dissolve into the glamorous flow he had never felt he belonged to. And so, in these years, Robbins learned that withdrawing was not failure. It was a way to recover, to keep his identity, and to prepare for the next stories he wanted to tell, roles with more humanistic and profound thinking, projects that even if known to few still created impact, and that a full life did not necessarily have to be illuminated on screens or on the red carpet, but was living honestly with oneself, even when the world outside continued without knowing about your existence. When Tim Robbins continued to live in the silence he chose after withdrawing from the Hollywood spotlight, he not only had to face the spiritual void from the breakup and the feeling of loneliness, but also had to step into another battle, silent but full of hardship, the battle of views and convictions. Robbins had always believed that art was not only entertainment, but also a tool to ask questions, to reflect society. And in those discreet years of living, he could not stay silent in the face of injustices he witnessed. He publicly spoke out against war, against policies he considered violations of human rights and ethics, without hesitation that those words could make his career even more difficult, because Hollywood did not always welcome people with sharp views, and people in the profession like him sometimes had to choose between temporary spotlight and loyalty to themselves. This choice was not easy at all. Every time he spoke in the press, on media, or in interviews, Tim knew he could be criticized, could be misunderstood by colleagues, could lose potential roles or big collaboration opportunities, because this industry often prioritized harmony, compliance, and sometimes saw independent voices as nuisances. There were times he stood before the decision: stay silent to continue appearing on screen, to be accepted by Hollywood, to enjoy the light and recognition, or speak up, keep his convictions, and accept the price, accept losing convenience, losing opportunities, and to some extent relationships in the industry. Robbins chose the second path. He accepted that he would have to trade, give up commercial projects, endure alienation in some professional communities, endure comments and criticism from the media, but in return, he kept his identity, kept loyalty to his own beliefs, and still continued to make art in the way he believed was right. This decision made the following years of Robbins become lonely, but also full of meaning. Every project he joined afterward, every role he chose, carried alertness and wise selection, not driven by the desire for easy success or pressure from Hollywood. He learned to stand firm in isolation, learned to accept that sometimes speaking up would make you forgotten, but it was the only way not to lose yourself. And from those very times of being rejected, misunderstood, alienated, Tim Robbins found inner strength, a man who might not be recognized by everyone, who might lose opportunities and fame, but could still keep his soul and personal values, could still tell important stories through art, and could still create profound impact on audiences, those willing to listen and understand. During this time, Robbins also realized one thing: the true value of art did not lie in the number of roles or the level of fame, but in the ability to stand up for what was right, in daring to speak out one's views, no matter the price to pay. And precisely thanks to this difficult decision, he not only kept his own identity, but also inspired generations of actors and audiences about the power of honesty, about choosing the difficult but worthwhile path, that sometimes staying silent to exist only brought emptiness, while speaking the truth, even if lonely and misunderstood, brought real meaning and created a legacy that no award could match. In the silence of alienation and criticism, Tim Robbins continued to walk, continued to contribute, continued to live fully with himself. And that very thing, though invisible to the outside world, was the strongest proof of the strength, will, and value of a true artist. After the years of enduring pressure from fame, from the trade-offs to maintain his views and personal identity, Tim Robbins began to direct his steps toward quiet but meaningful paths, withdrawing from the Hollywood spotlight to live a life that was almost completely detached from public attention. He devoted most of his energy to the Actors Gang, where he not only acted, but also taught, guided, trained, and sparked creativity and confidence for young actors, for people who had never thought they could stand on stage. Here, there were no bright lights, no rounds of applause, and no praises. But every performance, every rehearsal brought its own meaning. Robbins saw the impact of art on people, saw the smiles, the focused eyes, the moments of change that no one else noticed. Not stopping at the stage, Robbins also expanded his activities to the community and prisons, working directly with prisoners, helping them through theater to express emotions, learn to control themselves, regain confidence, and discover the hidden human part inside each person. These activities did not create any spotlight, did not appear on newspaper pages, and certainly did not bring money or fame, but they brought a value deeper than any award, a meaningful life, an opportunity to contribute to changing and supporting lives that had been abandoned or forgotten by society. In the eyes of the world, Robbins seemed to have disappeared, a man who once stood at the peak of Hollywood, now working in silence, but for himself, this was the most fulfilling period, where he lived true to his values, where every action had meaning and was dedicated with absolute passion and honesty. Every day, Robbins stepped into the classroom, stepped onto the rehearsal floor, saw faces that had never been recognized, people struggling with fear, loss, and loneliness, and he realized that the stage lights and acclaim he once craved no longer mattered. What mattered was the ability to make an impact, the ability to plant hope, the ability to help others find value in themselves. One scene, one rehearsal, one performance in prison might never appear on the big screen or in magazines, but it was living proof of the power of art and of Robbins' commitment that a man who once stood at the peak could still find meaning in silent actions, could still bring light to the darkest places, and could still live a full life even when no one saw. It was precisely in this silence and quietness that Tim Robbins found the peace he had never had while racing after the Hollywood spotlight. No one praised him, no one applauded, but step by step, session by session, project by project, they all contributed to creating a different legacy. The legacy of a man who lived and made art for value, for people rather than for glamour, fame, or money. His life at this time, though seen by few, was rich and profound, where every effort, every lesson, every moment of listening and sharing carried hope, change, and values that lights and fame could not bring. For Tim Robbins, this was the real return to his essence, returning to the original ideals he pursued when he first stepped into the world of art, to live and make meaningful art, not for applause, not for spotlight, but for the ability to change, support, and inspire people who needed to be seen. In the silence of Hollywood, among projects known to few, among limited but sincere audiences, Robbins found himself again, and learned that sometimes silence was the strongest light, because in it, the true person, true value, and true strength could exist without needing anyone to see. Even though he had found a quiet and meaningful rhythm through the Actors Gang, Tim Robbins still had to face another battle, silent but persistent. A battle that no one outside himself could witness or understand, the inner battle. No accident, no scandal, no glaring lights or scandal to mark it. But the struggle inside him lasted day after day, year after year, from the time he withdrew from the Hollywood spotlight to live and make art in his own way. Every morning when he woke up, Robbins had to face questions that no one could answer for him. Who am I, outside of the roles? What is my true value if I am not honored on screen or celebrated with awards? Do the years of sacrifice for art, for the community, for others mean anything if no one witnesses them, if no one truly understands and empathizes? The loneliness Tim Robbins experienced was not because he was completely alone. Susan Sarandon, the children, colleagues, and students in the actors' gang were always there, but they could not fully enter his inner world, could not understand the deep insecurity, the tension of balancing honesty with himself and the desire to be recognized, between isolation in the Hollywood world and responsibility to the people he guided on stage. That loneliness was the feeling of being displaced even when surrounded by people, the feeling that a part of him still stood outside everything that was happening, looking at the world, observing and evaluating, but unable to fully integrate. On long nights, when the city was quiet, when the lights in the house were off, Tim often listened to himself, facing unanswered questions, doubts about value, about purpose, about the ability to create real impact in a world that sometimes seemed not to care about his existence beyond the roles and the awards. In this silent struggle, Tim Robbins realized that every role, every moment on stage or in front of the camera was part of his identity, but that identity was not always seen or recognized by the world. He had spent many years learning to balance, learning to accept that not everyone understood or recognized what he created, and that sometimes the true value of a person lay in the ability to hold firm to oneself even when no one noticed, even when one's work was not praised, even when silent efforts might never be repaid. But this very inner battle, although silent and prolonged, created the strength, resilience, and depth that few possessed. Robbins learned that living with oneself, understanding and respecting one's own value, taking responsibility for one's choices, was more important than any spotlight. In these moments, loneliness no longer was pain just to endure, but became a space for reflection, to find out why he continued to make art, why he still wanted to plant hope, to teach, to create impact, and why standing firm in silence amid misunderstanding and alienation was precisely the strongest proof of his value and character. Tim Robbins lives and works in that void, a battle no one sees, a challenge that only he himself truly understands. But this very challenge has shaped the largest part of who he is: his determination, his endurance, his loyalty to personal values, and his ability to continue shining in his own way, even when the world does not pay attention, even when silent efforts seem invisible. And precisely because of that, the roles, the classes, the works he has dedicated from then on become deeper, carry more weight, and truly touch the hearts of those willing to listen. After the years of silent struggle with himself and the world around him, Tim Robbins began to realize a truth he had rarely dared to admit before. He did not need to belong to Hollywood to feel valuable or to live fully with art. Accepting that he stood outside the glamorous circle, that stage lights and awards did not define the true person inside, opened another door for him. The door of freedom, of redefining success in his own way. Instead of measuring value by fame or the level of appearance on big screens, Robbins found meaning in small works, in each rehearsal with the actors' gang, in teaching and inspiring young actors, in the moments of seeing students find themselves through art, and in the quiet stories that only those who participated could feel the transformative power of theater. The peace he found did not come from glory or applause, but from the ability to live honestly, to keep his own values, and to know that his efforts had meaning, even if not seen by the whole world. These years, Tim Robbins learned to reevaluate himself. A day passing in silence, without noise, without bright lights, but full of presence and meaning, was better than any blockbuster film he had ever been in. Step by step, He built a life in which work, art, and family were not dominated by the need to prove or compare, but were carried out because of belief, because of responsibility, and because of the deep values he cherished. Family became the new center of his life. Robbins' children grew up, each with their own personality and separate journey, but their very presence and growth brought him a sense of peace he had never had during the peak of his career. Mornings waking up in the quiet house, simple dinners with family, moments of playing and talking with the children. All those seemingly simple things became the bricks building, a true feeling of being home. A place where Tim felt he belonged and was needed. A place where fame, lights, awards, or recognition no longer determined his own value. With no more noise, no more invisible pressures from the industry, Tim Robbins lived a slow but fulfilling life, where every action, every decision was made with alertness, consideration, and awareness of true value. He continued to participate in artistic projects, but with a different mindset, not chasing trends, not competing for positions, but choosing roles, works, and activities that satisfied his spirit, connected with people, and inspired in the most authentic way. In the silence of life, Robbins found inner strength. He did not need to be seen to know he existed, did not need recognition to know that what he did had meaning, and did not need spotlight to affirm his value. The choice to withdraw from Hollywood, to live with projects known to few, to spend time with family and community was exactly how he rebuilt his life. A life full of meaning and peace, though not loud, but real. These years, Tim Robbins proved that success does not lie in standing at any peak, but in the ability to live honestly, to create value for himself and for others, and to find happiness right in the small but complete things. He became a model of a life where every step was considered, every choice reflected his identity, and every moment was lived fully. Hollywood could continue to shine with lights and applause, but Tim Robbins had found his own light, a peaceful but strong light, enough to keep him standing firm, enough to continue creating art, influencing others, and proving that life, even if not brightly illuminated, could still be truly complete, meaningful, and beautiful in its own way that no one else could measure or fully understand. When looking back at Tim Robbins's entire journey, from the unstable childhood days, from the quiet and disappointing early career years, from the years standing at the peak but still feeling displaced, to the years living detached, making silent art, and creating value in the community, we realize that Robbins is not a winner in the way Hollywood usually tells. Not loud, not flashy, not filled with lights and applause. He is a winner in a different, deeper, and quieter way. A man who did not lose himself, a man who dared to stay loyal to his values, who dared to choose his own path, even when facing loneliness, alienation, and lost opportunities. Tim Robbins' legacy is not only the awards or the classic roles, but first of all, the Shawshank Redemption, the timeless film, a symbol of hope, of patience and courage in the most desperate moments, a work through which Robbins transmitted the values he cherished most: the courage to stand up, the ability to endure suffering while still keeping humanity, and the belief that light could exist even in the deepest darkness. Besides that, the values he protected, honesty, the ability to think independently, speaking up for what is right, and dedication to the community through the Actors Gang, are all proofs of a life lived without chasing the spotlight, yet still creating long-lasting and profound impact. The message from Robbins' life is clear and powerful. There are people who do not need to belong, do not need lights, do not need the recognition of the crowd to become great. Greatness is not about being seen by the whole world, but about the ability to live fully with oneself, the ability to create value, the ability to inspire, and the ability to persistently follow one's own path even when no one stands beside. Robbins has shown that greatness lies in human choice itself, in keeping one's identity and in turning loneliness and losses into strength to keep moving forward. In each passing year, while Hollywood continued to chase light and fame, Tim Robbins chose to step onto a different path. A quiet, silent path, but full of meaning. He stood firm in silence, drawing valuable lessons from the wounds, from the pains that were never acknowledged, and from the imperfect relationships, to build a life where every moment, every decision, every action carried real value, not for the eyes of the world, but for himself, for his children, and for those who found inspiration from what he did. And when his story is looked back upon, what makes Robbins different is not the number of roles, not the level of fame or the awards, but precisely the ability to hold himself steady against temptation, against pressure, and against the voids of life. The ability to live honestly and continue creating value even when no one recognizes it. He proved that even without standing in the spotlight, even without receiving all the acclaim, a person could still live fully, could still create a legacy, and could still become a symbol for timeless values. Sometimes, the greatest pain in life is not losing everything, not failure or rejection, but living an entire life without ever truly belonging anywhere, without ever finding a solid place in the world you pass through. Tim Robbins lived like that, but precisely because of that way of living, he became an unmistakable icon, a man who stood alone, but still great, still complete, and still left light for those willing to see. A proof that honesty, determination, and inner courage could overcome all glamour, all lights, and all challenges of life. The story of Tim Robbins is a living proof of how a person can reach the peak of a career, win an Oscar, create immortal roles like Andy Dufresne in The Shawshank Redemption, but still have to face loneliness, displacement, and profound spiritual losses that few realize. The most heartbreaking is perhaps the relationship that lasted more than 2 decades with Susan Sarandon, where Tim found his only anchor in a world he never felt he belonged to, but which ultimately dissolved silently, without scandal, without explosion. Only silence remained and the haunting words, "You were never there," like a deep cut into the heart of the man who once knew sacrifice, who once stood firm amid the harsh pressures of Hollywood. Even more painful, it was precisely the early years of his career, with small roles, continuous rejected auditions, and the feeling of "I exist, but no one needs me," that forged a determined and resilient Tim Robbins, who learned to turn loneliness into strength, who learned to live honestly even when no one recognized it. What makes Robbins great is not only talent, but the choice to stand firm with himself. He turned down commercial roles to keep his identity, withdrew from the Hollywood spotlight to focus on the stage and community through the Actors Gang, found meaning in quiet but valuable work, and raised his children in an environment full of love. This is a valuable lesson for the American people. Success is not measured by fame or money, but by the ability to live honestly, to hold personal values firmly, and to create real impact for others. Tim Robbins' story reminds us that even when facing loneliness, failure, or broken relationships, one can still find hope, can still live fully, and leave a worthy legacy. That greatness is not about standing at the peak, but about standing firm with one's true self. If the story of Tim Robbins has touched your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a way to honor the man who lived honestly and determinedly, even when no one saw. Stay with us in the next video to explore more emotional journeys and life lessons from people who dare to live in their own way.